Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers, and today, the FDA's shift from advisory committees to expert panels and what this means for science and transparency in drug regulation. Dr. Caleb Alexander, an internist and epidemiologist who served on many of these advisory committees for the FDA, typically around pharmaceuticals, joins me to talk about the work these committees do and why this shift is concerning. Let's listen. Dr. Caleb Alexander, welcome back to Public Health on Call. It's been a minute. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So today we're talking about the FDA and these expert panels, but apparently to get to that, you and I have chatted about this, we first have to start with advisory committees. Would you give us a little background on advisory committees for the FDA and your experience working with these committees?
Yeah, well, thanks. It's a great question. And I have had the fortune to serve on and chair many different advisory committees focused on prescription drug regulation for the Food and Drug Administration. And, the FDA has a lot of work going on and a lot of regulatory activity. And you can imagine that there are a lot of clear calls that they make. We're talking here about prescription drugs where there's either substantial evidence of safety and efficacy and a product makes it across the line, or there's clearly not, and the manufacturer has more work to do. But there are some cases that are thorny and that are in the gray zone, right? Where the evidence may be mixed, where there may be really complex risk-benefit trade-offs, there may be disagreements among different parties within the FDA, or there may be disagreements between the FDA and a drug manufacturer about the product's safety and efficacy. And this is really where these advisory committees come into play. And I think the FDA has used these to help provide guidance. Now, to be clear, the FDA is not bound to do what an advisory committee advises, and you'll have to check the numbers, but I think that there's been some work suggesting that in about 4 out of 5 cases, the FDA goes the way of the advisory committee, perhaps in about 1 out of 5 they don't. But in any case, when there are votes, the votes aren't binding and the FDA can do as they wish. But I think the FDA nevertheless really values the expertise and feedback that they get from these committees.
So there's a manufacturer that wants to bring a drug to market. They have a body of evidence that they need someone to look at and say, like, yes, the benefits outweigh the risks of this drug, or no, we need to do a little bit more research. And so this panel looks at all of that evidence and makes recommendations based on that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what the committee does. Typically, the committee may be staffed by 10 to 15, sometimes as many as 20 outside experts. The experts represent a broad range of disciplines and areas of expertise. You'll have practicing physicians and epidemiologists like myself. You'll have biostatisticians. You may have human factors experts. You may have toxicologists and so on. Typically, there are representatives also representing patients and patient advocacy organizations. There's often an industry representative, and it really, anytime I'm on these committees, I marvel and am reminded just that, as I like to say, all of us are smarter than any of us, and that the committees really can do good work by digging in and earnestly engaging around the matters at hand. I should say the committees aren't exclusively used for products that haven't yet hit the market, so the FDA also uses advisory committees. Here, we're still focused on drugs. The FDA uses committees for other purposes as well. But when it comes to pharmaceuticals, they also can call advisory committees for regulatory matters for products that have been on the market for a while, such as to review new safety information that may be emerging and to consider whether or not there should be label modifications or additional testing that manufacturers are required to fulfill.
Now, tell us the difference between an advisory committee and an expert panel.
Well, to be clear, the advisory committees, the FDA has a long-standing history of holding and using advisory committees. And there was actually a federal act, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, that was passed in 1972 that established the framework for these committees. And again, not only does the FDA use these for matters beyond drugs, but also other federal agencies use the Federal Advisory Committee Act to provide guidance. And the Act stipulates that federal agencies need to fulfill filing notice in the Federal Register so that the general public is informed with appropriate advance notice that a committee is to be held, providing formal transcripts that are publicly released regarding the proceedings that were discussed, instituting standardized but thorough conflict of interest reviews. In the case of the committees that I've participated in, which have been more than a dozen that I've sat on or chaired, in my recall, I think almost everyone had also had votes where you vote independently. You don't know what the person to your left and right is voting as you're voting, but there's publicly reporting out of those votes and the like. So these are all part and parcel of the advisory committees as they've historically been used. More recently, the FDA has held what have been called expert panels. And I think that there's been some concern about these panels expressed by many different parties, including scientists and staff within the FDA, because the panels are really a departure from the sorts of features of advisory committees that I just noted. So in May of 2025, regulators convened a panel that was focused on talc safety, the safety of talc powder. In June, the next month, there was a roundtable that was held on the suitability of infant formula. And then in July, just a month later, the agency held an expert panel on antidepressant use during pregnancy. And, I think that these expert panels have garnered some interest and some controversy because they are a departure from the advisory committee framework, and they haven't followed the suite of practices that advisory committees follow and that are intended to promote transparent and thorough and careful deliberation about the scientific matters at hand.
And so from these expert panels, maybe you could pick one and talk about it. What have the outcomes been? Like, are the outcomes themselves troubling, or are we talking more about like the procedure being shirked is the problem here?
Yeah, well, I think it's a little bit too early to tell. And it's a great question. To my knowledge, as we sit here today in September, I'm not aware that the FDA has undertaken major revisions in the regulation of these products, talc, infant formula, antidepressants. But I think it's a bit of a moving target. I'm not aware of whether and how the deliberations have changed FDA policy. And I think that's frankly part of the concern and part of the problem. The general public and clinicians and patients and drug developers and investors, venture cap, private equity, there are lots and lots of parties that really have a stake in this and that stand to gain and benefit from a careful and thorough and transparent process whereby these sorts of matters are deliberated. And the concern, I think the risk that the FDA faces in switching from a model where advisory committees are used to where expert panels are used is that the FDA will lose the accountability that comes with the advisory committee framework. I mean, the requirements that meetings be posted sufficiently in advance and that an agenda be provided and that briefing materials be publicly disclosed and that conflict of interest be vetted and that transcripts are provided and that votes are recorded. These are all important components of what make the advisory committees valuable. And I think that there's a concern that because expert panels are assembled ad hoc and because the materials that are assembled and cultivated and the membership, the attendees, because it's all set by people who are convening the panel rather than through a process that's established like a chartered process, like is established through the Federal Advisory Committee Act, I think there's concern that the quality of the science will be diminished in the process. And ultimately, I think everyone stands to lose, including the FDA, if the FDA's credibility is undermined in this way.
Now, are the advisory committees still happening, or these have completely taken the place of those?
Well, I'm not aware of any policy that said that there won't be further advisory committees, and there have been some. There's actually been a reduction in the number of advisory committees that predates the current administration. I haven't charted carefully the trends over time. I suppose some of your listeners can do that as they like, but I believe that there have been noteworthy reductions in the FDA's reliance on advisory committees over time. And to be clear, advisory committees no picnic. I mean, they take a lot of time to organize. They are costly for the FDA. There's opportunity costs. You can't have them for everything. So if you have them for one topic, you're not having them for another. There's a lot of paperwork. I have to fill out conflict of interest form after conflict of interest form. They're exhausting, frankly, but I think the FDA gets very high quality information from them. And it's hard to imagine a process where the FDA is essentially just sort of handpicking a bunch of folks to come into town and sit around a table and riff on a topic for a half day or a day is going to provide anywhere near the same quality of evidence. And I think there's a real risk that the quality of the scientific deliberations are undermined. I think that much is crystal clear. If you look at some of the fallout of the May, June, and July panels, and concerns about potential conflicts of interest among panel members. The concerns, for example, that one of the panels really elevated. I think there was concern about the panel for antidepressant use during pregnancy, that it really elevated skeptics of the use of antidepressants during pregnancy, that perhaps disproportionately to the real dangers involved if you consider the flip side. And I'll be the first to say these matters are complex, right? As a pharmacoepidemiologist, one of our biggest pearls is that it's not just about risks or just about benefits. It's about risks and benefits. And that's certainly the case when you're talking about a pregnant woman and a fetus and trying to decide what's best. But I think that, again, some of the fallout from these panels that has happened and some of the concerns about them are a reflection of the broader risks of departing from the advisory committee model and moving to a model where you just sort of, ad hoc gather a bunch of people in a room and let them go wild on a topic.
Is the convening of these panels and the topics that they are meeting to talk about, it feels like that in and of itself is sending a message, not just that they're doing the expert panels, but what they're choosing to do them for.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, I don't think the panels are performative. I'm not that cynical. I think that the FDA is truly interested in these matters and truly is trying to figure out whether and how regulation should change. And I think you could say the same about advisory committees, right? Like if the FDA decides to hold an advisory committee regarding whether, prescription opioids should be relabeled to better align the label with the extant scientific evidence, I think there is a message that's communicated there that the FDA believes that this is a serious matter and that they're going to elevate this they're going to spend some chits on an advisory committee when, again, there's opportunity costs. They could also have held one on whether bisphosphonates are still causing osteonecrosis of the jaw. That's a treatment for osteoporosis that has a rare but serious adverse effect. The FDA is well regarded around the world. It has been historically for the quality of the science and the regulation that takes place. And I believe that the expert panels are a departure from an established and well-founded way of doing business when it comes to consulting outside experts, namely the convening of formal advisory committees. I think that expert panels are arguably easier, right? Because you don't have to fulfill all the steps that you have to fill with advisory committees. And frankly, expert panels allow for you to pick who you want to be in the room. And, that may be sort of expedient politically or, maybe from a regulatory perspective, but I think it's penny wise, pound foolish at best. I think that transparency and accountability are really the foundations of a lot of the credibility that the FDA has. And my concern is that if the FDA continues to lean into these expert panels and continues to turn away from formal advisory committees, I'm concerned that the FDA's reputation and credibility will suffer.
Dr. Caleb Alexander, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.